Welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the Build America, Buy America Act's Buy America preference. This webinar is intended for HUD CPF grantees. My name is Rachel Mechaton. I'm with Enterprise Community Partners, the host for this webinar. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the HUD Exchange with the presentation and transcript. Please note that participant audio and chat is off. To view closed captions during the webinar, you may click on the CC icon in the controls toolbar. The Q&A function is available. We encourage you to listen to the presentation and enter your questions towards the end of the webinar because they may be answered during the presentation. We'll respond to questions live at the end. If your question is not answered, or if you have additional questions, we will provide instructions at the end of the webinar on how to access the new BABA Ask a Question help desk on the HUD Exchange. With that, I'll pass it to our presenters. And I'll specifically invite Kim Nash from the HUD Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Development to speak.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon and welcome to this training. I'm Kim Nash. I am a Senior Advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Development. And again, we appreciate you being here today. We understand that you may have questions about the implementation of BABA, and I am optimistic we will address many of your questions today. I do want to remind everyone that CPD Notice 23-12 was posted a couple of weeks ago. It provides implementation guidance for the Buy American preference. There are also a host of great resources on the HUD Exchange. As the BABA trainings are completed, a recording, transcript, and copy of the slide deck will also be posted on the HUD Exchange.
Thanks so much, Kim. On behalf of the team at Enterprise Community Partners, I'm Clint Whited, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's Build America, Buy America Act webinar for community project funding grantees. We have a lot of great content to share with you today, so I'm going to hand the presentation over to my colleague, Chris Andrews, who will present the first segment of today's webinar. Chris, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Clint. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I know it's a busy time of year. We have a lot going on, so thank you all for taking the time. As Clint said, Chris Andrews, part of the Enterprise Community Partners team, and we're here today to talk about the Buy America preference. We have two primary goals for today's session. So number one, we want to make sure we're giving you all an overview of the rules, the requirements, and how they apply to CPF grantees. And then we want to walk through the basic steps that you all should be taking and how you think about implementing the Buy America preference. Before we begin, I do want to make sure to note CPF does not apply to FY22 or FY23 CPF grants. If the FY24 appropriations bill is enacted by Congress prior to February 22nd, 2024, the BAP will also not apply to FY24 CPF grantees. So if you all are on just as a FY22 or just as an FY23 grantee, it is important to note the BAP does not apply to those grants alone. In today's session, our goal, we're going to start to talk through project planning. What are the projects and the products that are covered by the regulations? Move through the implementation process. How do you think about if BAP does or does not apply to your project, and how to comply with the regulations, and then walking through a couple of project examples. As Kim said, I do encourage you all, if you haven't yet, download, read CPD Notice 2312. There is also a webinar held on November 2nd that is already posted on the HUD Exchange that provided an overview on BABA and the Buy America preference, and really encourage you all to review that webinar if you haven't already. So to begin, what is the Build America, Buy America Act? It was enacted as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in November 2021. And it requires that any iron, steel, construction, materials, or manufactured products used in an infrastructure project funded with federal dollars be produced in the US. The Buy America preference is that requirement. And again, it is applicable to all federal infrastructure funding. This is not a HUD alone requirement. It is applicable whether we're talking about FEMA funding or DOT funding, HUD funding. Any federal dollars need to comply with the Build America, Buy America Act. So to begin, let's start to think about what types of projects and what types of products are covered by the BAP. So first, BAP applies to any infrastructure project that includes construction, alteration, maintenance, or repair. Even if the primary purpose of that project is not infrastructure, if it is involving construction, maintenance, alteration, or repair around infrastructure, the BAP would apply. And so what does infrastructure mean? Infrastructure is defined in the Act, includes a range of public projects, the public facilities, roads, bridges, real property, anything that's involving kind of the construction, alteration, maintenance, or repair of that infrastructure. And so let's kind of talk a little bit more of the types of projects that are covered. So our left-hand column is examples of CPD-funded activities that could be subject to the BAP. It could include rehab or construction of buildings and real property, development or the rehab of public facilities or community improvements, infrastructure improvements, utility installation or improvements, updating or improving water systems, electrical utilities, broadband infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. Those would all be activities that could qualify as meeting the definition of infrastructure. What doesn't meet the definition of infrastructure? Examples of CPD funded activities that might not be subject to the BAP. It includes acquisition of real property, relocation and demolition, any public service or service activity, operating expenses if they don't include maintenance or repair or rehab, supportive services, short-term rental assistance payments, special economic development activities, and then any administrative activities, and then disaster and emergency response funding are generally not subject to the BAP. And so what are the types of products that fall under the Buy America preference? There are three primary categories: iron and steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. So let's dive into those in a bit more depth. The first, iron and steel. So this is an item consisting completely or predominantly of iron, steel, or both. Predominantly means that the cost of the iron or steel content exceeds 50% of the total cost of all of the item's components. So if the steel in that product equals more than 50% of the cost components, it would be considered iron and steel. How do we need to make sure that we're complying? All the manufacturing of that iron and steel, from initial melting through any coatings, must occur in the United States. So the entire manufacturing life cycle of that product must occur in the US. Two, construction materials. Construction materials in the guidance and the regs are divided into two different categories specifically listed and not listed. They include non-ferrous metals, plastic, polymer-based products, lumber, drywall, replacement windows, glass, not replacement windows, that would be a manufactured products. And for the construction material, all manufacturing processes for the construction material must occur in the US. And then for the third is manufactured products. And these are materials that are processed into a specific form or shape, or they're materials that are combined with other items to create a product with different properties. So here, right, that plastic framed replacement window would be a manufactured product, while plate glass would be a construction material. And how do you make sure you're complying? The final product must be manufactured in the US, and at least 55% of the cost components must be produced or manufactured in the United States. Sorry. So we're going to move on to project planning. So first, I want to just talk about when does the BAP begin to apply for CPF grantees. So as we said at the top, CPF does not apply to FY22 or FY23 awards. The Buy America preference begins for CPF grantees to take effect on February 22nd, 2024. So that is, if the appropriation is made, the FY24 appropriation is made after February 22nd, 2024, the BAP would apply for FY24. Then for any appropriations made after August 23rd, 2024, the BAP would apply for construction materials and manufactured products. So as we're thinking about the BAP process, we want to talk about what are the two potential outcomes. So one, you're needing to comply with the BAP, or the BAP is not applying. The BAP might not apply for one of three reasons. One, the project is not meeting the definition of an infrastructure project. Two, you're able to utilize one of HUD's general waivers. Or three, you're able to obtain a project-specific waiver to exclude the project or a portion of the project from the BAP. And so let's talk through how you make that determination. And we'll go into more depth in each of these steps, but we'll talk through them at a high level right now. So first, are the funds being used for an infrastructure project? If no, the BAP likely doesn't apply. If yes, do the committed funds include CPF grants? If no, the BAP doesn't apply from a CPF perspective. If there are other grant funds for which the BAP does apply, you would need to follow those requirements. Step three, is the project using products that are subject to the BAP? Is it using iron and steel, manufactured products, construction materials? If no, the BAP doesn't apply. If yes, I'm moving on to step four. Did Congress appropriate the CPF funds on or after the effective date of the BAP? So again, for FY24 grantees, was the FY24 appropriations bill enacted on or after February 22nd, 2024? If yes, then the BAP would apply. If no, the BAP would not apply for FY24 grantees. Step five, is the project covered in whole or in part by any of the HUD general waivers? If yes, the BAP doesn't apply. If no, could the project qualify for a project-specific waiver? If yes, you can consider that waiver for all or a portion of the project. And if no, then the BAP likely applies to the project. You'll need to make sure that you're documenting compliance. So let's walk through this in a little bit more detail. Number one, are the funds being used for an infrastructure project? So that could include rehab, maintenance, reconstruction of buildings or real property, construction or renovation of a public facility or infrastructure, such as community centers, emergency shelters, or park improvements. Step 2, do the committed funds include CPF grants? If yes, the BAP may apply. If no, the BAP does not apply due to the inclusion of CPF funds, but you need to consider if there are other sources of funds from HUD or other federal agencies coming into play. So if the CPF grant is being stacked with block grant funding or DOT funding, then you may be subject to the BAP based on the requirements for that agency or that program. Step 3, does the project use products that are subject to the BAP? Review the scope of work. Work with your contractor, your developer, your subrecipients to determine, is there iron and steel? Are there construction materials? Are there manufactured products in the scope, in the expected outcome of the project? If yes, we'll continue on to step 4, the BAP may apply. If no, the BAP doesn't apply. Step 4, right? We just saw this chart, but did Congress appropriate the CPF funds on or after the effective date of the BAP? So again, right, for FY22 and FY23 CPF grants that aren't connected to FY24 or FY25 grants or other federal funding, the BAP wouldn't apply. For FY24, if the appropriations bill is enacted after February 22nd, 2024, the BAP would apply only for iron and steel. And then for any appropriations bill enacted after August 23, 2024, the CPF grants included in that appropriations bill would be subject to the BAP for all covered products: iron and steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. Step 5, is the project covered in whole or in part by any general waivers? So the first general waiver is exigent and emergency circumstances. Is there an urgent need to complete the project because of a threat to life, safety, or property? If yes, the waiver may apply, and the BAP is not required for the project. Clint will talk about what documentation you need to think about if you're considering a general waiver in a few minutes. The second general waiver is the de minimis and small grants and minor components waiver, and this is kind of broken into 2 different categories. First is the total cost of the project from all sources, federal, non-federal, equal to or less than $250,000. So even if your CPF grant is less than $250,000, if the total project budget is greater than, you can't use this waiver. But if the total budget is below $250,000, you can use the de minimis small grants waiver. The second part of this waiver is that it can be applied to a portion of products used in an infrastructure project if the cumulative cost of those products doesn't exceed 5% of the total cost of the covered products. So if you are in a scenario where there is one product that you can't source locally, you can't source domestically, and that product doesn't exceed 5% of the total cost of covered products, then you can use the de minimis and small grants waiver for that portion of the project, and that does not need to be a domestically sourced product. And then the final general waiver is for tribal recipients. Is the project being funded by a tribal recipient? If yes, the tribal recipient waiver may apply, and the BAP is not required for the project. So moving forward, if a general waiver isn't available, could the project qualify for a project-specific waiver? And project-specific waivers are organized into 3 different categories. So the public interest waiver, if the use of the American-made product would be inconsistent with public interest. Non-availability waiver, the product that you need isn't produced in the United States in sufficient quantities or an appropriate quality. And unreasonable cost, if the inclusion of an American-made product would increase the cost of the overall project by more than 25%, you could consider requesting a project-specific waiver. And so how do you go about doing that? So you'd reach out to HUD, the CPD BABA at HUD.gov for TA on preparing that waiver request. With their guidance, you would prepare your waiver using the requirements from OMB's Made in America office. You would submit your waiver application to HUD, provide any additional information as requested, and then you'd move forward to proceed with the public comment on the period on the Federal Register and final approval by OMB's Made in America office. All waivers would ultimately go from HUD to OMB for final approval. And then all approved waivers would be posted in the madeinamerica.gov website. I highly encourage you all, if you're considering a project-specific waiver, to begin by looking at CPD Notice 2312. The project-specific waiver process is outlined beginning on page 19. So again, before turning it over to Clint to talk through project implementation and record keeping, just want to walk through these steps one more time. And Clint will talk about this. We encourage you to use a flow chart like this or use a checklist like this as you're going through all of your projects to think about, okay, does the BAP apply? Yes or no? And you can use it as a documentation tool to show, here's how we made our determination that the BAP doesn't apply. We went through and asked these 6 questions, and this is where we ended up in a BAP does not apply category. So number 1, are the funds being used for an infrastructure project? Are you working in a building or real property with conducting alteration, rehab, construction, maintenance? 2, do the committed funds include CPF grants? 3, does the project use products that are subject to the BAP? Are you using iron and steel? Are you using construction materials? Are you using a manufactured product? 4, did Congress appropriate the CPF funds on or after the effective date of the BAP? Right, the important date right now for iron and steel is February 22nd, 2024. Step 5, is the project covered in whole or in part by any of the HUD general waivers? And then step 6, could the project qualify for a project-specific waiver? And as you work through that flow chart, document how you reached your determination for each and maintain that in your program file as part of your record keeping. And I'm going to turn it over to Clint now to talk more about record keeping.
Thank you so much, Chris. Now that we have a better understanding of the steps we need to follow to determine if the BAP applies to our CPF projects, let's take some time to talk a little bit more about how to implement what we've learned. Documenting your BAP determination, whether your project is subject to the BAP or not, is critical for all projects. It's important to follow all established record-keeping requirements and to maintain good records for all of your CPF projects. So let's get into it. To operationalize the BAP requirements locally, you should review existing procurement policies and procedures to ensure that the BAP requirements are included in your procurement documents and contracts. BAP contract language is included in the special conditions section of your CPF HUD grant agreement. The contract language should be incorporated into all agreements, even if the BAP does not yet apply because of the phased implementation date. The BAP must be included in all bidding documents, subawards, contracts, and purchase orders for products supplied to complete the work. For record keeping, grantees should follow standard requirements for record keeping on all CPF projects. Maintaining detailed compliance documentation that clearly shows how you determined applicability of the BAP and how you implemented the BAP requirements is important. Without good documentation, it's impossible to demonstrate compliance when your project's eventually monitored. So when we talk about documentation and record keeping, that includes maintaining copies of all written communication with stakeholders about the BAP requirements. Keep all of that in your project file. Documenting and keeping detailed notes on your BAP determination, and collecting and reviewing and filing copies of all product certifications for the project as required by BAP. So let's shift gears a little bit here and get into a few project examples. I know that you're all eager to apply what we've learned about BAP determinations earlier. So let's take a look at a few examples and test our knowledge. So our first project example. In January 2025, a grantee awarded $1 million in CPF funds. The funds were obligated through an appropriations bill that was enacted in March of 2024. The funds are used for the construction of a neighborhood center in a low to moderate income census tract. Does the BAP apply to this project? And before we look at the answer, I want you all to think back on the BAP determination process that Chris walked us through earlier. There are a few important things you want to consider as you look at whether or not the BAP applies to your project. First, is it an infrastructure project according to the definition? Does the project include iron and steel, manufactured products, or construction materials? You might need to take a closer look at CPD Notice 2023-12 to refresh your memory on the two types of construction materials. You have the specifically listed and the not listed. Is the funding subject to the BAP based on the phased implementation waiver? So looking at dates. And do any of the other waivers apply? You might be looking at exigent circumstances, de minimis, small grains, or tribal recipients. And so based on what we know of this example, for funds that were appropriated in March of 2024 for the construction of a neighborhood center, let's take a look at the answer. So now that you've had a second to think about it, this is what we know. The project is an infrastructure project. It's construction. The grant funds were obligated after February 22nd, 2024. And the project's total budget is $1 million. So yes, the BAP applies to iron and steel on this project. Since the funds were obligated by HUD before August 23rd, 2024, thinking about that chart with the dates, the grantee does not need to ensure the BAP compliance for construction materials or manufactured products, just the iron and steel. So that's our first example. We've got another one for you. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next example. Okay, so further into the future, in June 2026, a grantee awarded $200,000 in FY 2025 CPF funds for the rehabilitation of a community park. The grantee is using several other local funding sources, and the total project budget is $500,000. The project involves repaving walkways and the parking lot and installing a playground. Does the BAP apply to this project? So again, as you walk back through your BAP determination process that we discussed earlier, some key questions you're asking yourself. Is it an infrastructure project according to the definition? Does it include iron and steel, manufactured products, or construction materials? Is the funding subject to the BAP based on phased implementation dates? And do any of the other waivers apply? So let's go ahead and take a look at our answer here. So The project is an infrastructure project based on the definition. You have a construction activity there in the parking lot with the playground. The grant funds were obligated after August 23rd, 2024, and the project's total budget is $500,000. So yes, the BAP applies to this project for iron and steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. We're going all the way here. All right, I've got one more example for you. Let's take a look at that one. A grantee operates a senior center using FY24 CPF funds. The FY24 appropriations bill is enacted on February 1st, 2024. The budget is $300,000. Does the BAP apply to this project? So again, you're going through your checklist to make your determination. You're looking at the definition of an infrastructure project. You're asking yourself if the project's going to use iron and steel, manufactured products, or construction materials. You're looking at the other waivers and determining if any of those apply to this situation. Let's take a look at the answer. So for this third example, the obligation date under phased implementation waiver is one reason why the BAP does not apply. However, it's not the only reason. Operating costs of a public facility does not constitute an infrastructure project, so we can stop there. The BAP does not apply because the project does not involve construction, alteration, maintenance, or repair of infrastructure, such as building and real property improvements. So it looks like, and I'm just checking over here in the Q&A section, looks like we're receiving a few questions. We're going to have some time to address several of those questions live in a couple minutes. But before we do that, I'm going to review some of the key takeaways from today's webinar, and then we'll get to your questions. So first, we learned that the BAP applies to projects that include the construction, alteration, maintenance, and repair of infrastructure. Then we learned that all components necessary to complete an infrastructure project should be classified to identify those items in the project scope to which the BAP applies. Those classifications include iron and steel, construction materials, or manufactured products. Finally, it's important that you review the pipeline of projects that you have locally, both those currently underway and those that you're planning, to identify which projects and materials are subject to the BAP. For more details on each of those items, you can always refer to the CPD Quick Guide that we've posted on the HUD Exchange website. We also strongly encourage you to review the steps in that CPD Notice 2023-12 to determine the applicability of the BAP at both the project and the product level. And remember, Chris walked us through all of those steps with the flow chart earlier in this session. Additionally, be sure that you document the process to determine if the BAP applies. You actually want to have that determination written and in your file, because record keeping, as always, is critical on your CPF infrastructure projects. Also, we recommend that you be sure to include the BAP language in all written agreements, contracts, subawards, and material procurement documents. Go ahead and get that language in those agreements and those documents now. This will set you up for success when you ask contractors and material suppliers for their BAP product certifications in the future. Finally, program-wide general waivers for the BAP include, just as a review, if there are exigent circumstances and the time spent in complying would affect the health or safety of the public, the exigent circumstances waiver may apply. If the total project cost is less than $250,000, the de minimis waiver may apply. And then phased implementation spreads the effective dates for the programs and the materials across the next few years. So be sure to refer back to the program-specific timeline for phased implementation. For CPF grants, the implementation date is based on the date that Congress establishes the FY 2024 budget as part of the FY 2024 appropriations grant. Again, project-specific waivers may be available for three reasons. Adhering to the BAP would be inconsistent with the public interest, so that's the public interest waiver. Covered materials are not produced in the United States in sufficient and reasonably available quantities or of a satisfactory quality, so that's the non-availability waiver. And finally, inclusion of covered materials will increase the cost of the overall project by more than 25%. and that's the unreasonable cost waiver. Finally, grantees should identify sources for materials that are made in America as early as possible. This way, you'll know early on if you might need a project or product-specific waiver. Be sure to refer to the text of Notice CPD 2023-12 for more information about general waivers and project-specific waivers. And at this time, I'd like to bring Kim from HUD back in before we move on to Q&A. Kim, is there anything you'd like to add here?
Yes, I would. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Thank you, first of all, Clint and Chris, for your presentations. That was a lot of great content. So I want to take a minute to reiterate a couple of points that both Clint and Chris have made during today's presentation. First, make sure you're evaluating all of your projects and activities to determine if the BOP does or does not apply, and then document that decision in your project file. Second, make sure you are passing down the BOP requirements to subrecipients, contractors, and vendors. And keep in mind, if you have questions after this webinar, you can submit an AAQ through the HUD Exchange for additional guidance. Thanks.
Thanks, Kim. And with that, let's take a look at the Q&A. I'm seeing a couple of questions here that are good ones for us to get started. Let's see here. Pull this up. Okay, easy one. Will the webinar presentation and recording be shared with attendees? Of course. The webinar presentation, transcription, and recording will be posted on the HUD Exchange within 1 month following the webinar. So anyone will be able to access it from the new BABA webpage on the Exchange. So we're gonna have all the materials up, the webinar, the recording, the slides, you name it, it'll be there. All right, let's see, we've got another question here. Question is, can you confirm the applicability dates from the phased implementation waiver? So yes, the BAP applies for iron and steel for your CPF grants beginning on February 22nd, 2024. For all other covered products, that date is August 23rd, 2024. And as a reminder, very important, we've covered this a few times here, but it bears repeating. The applicability dates are based off of when the appropriation is made by Congress. So as of today, the appropriations have not been made by Congress. And if the FY 2024 full year appropriation is finalized on or after February 22nd, 2024, the BAP will apply to FY 2024 CPF awards. So, keep your eyes on the news and you'll see when Congress passes a full year budget, and then we'll be able to determine if the BAP is going to apply to CPF for FY24. All right, I'm going to pop it over to Chris. Chris, are you seeing some questions that you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, a number of great questions. Thank you all. A couple questions asking to clarify the types of activities that the BAP does and does not apply to. So the BAP only applies to projects that involve construction, repair, alteration, or maintenance to infrastructure. So in the context of CPF funds, this is generally any of those activities: construction, repair, alteration, or maintenance to real property. It could be public facilities, it could be infrastructure, it could be any activity where you're touching on buildings or real property and doing one of those activities. CPF funds are really, really flexible, which is great. But in terms of providing a concrete list of what would be and not be eligible activities is something we can't do as a result of that. So do encourage you all to carefully review your scope, your project description against the definition of infrastructure. And as Kim said, if you have additional questions, by all means, please reach out. Let's see. Another question here. If a 200,000 FY24 CPF project that's using iron and steel is funded with an additional $150,000 in local funding, does the BAP apply to the entire project or just the CPF portion? Great question. A couple of questions came in around this topic. Because the total project budget is exceeding $250,000, the de minimis and small grants waiver doesn't apply, and the BAP would apply to the entire project, to that full, I think, $350,000 project example in this question. Let's see, Clint, other questions coming in for you?
Yeah, I've got a few here that we can respond to. First one, is there specific subrecipient agreement language for BABA that we should be including in our upcoming 2024 procurement documents and agreements? So yes, grantees may include the BABA language from their FY24 CPF grant agreement in any subrecipient agreement to ensure BABA compliance by subrecipients, contractors, really any participant in the process. The language that HUD has included in your agreements for CPF, for BABA, it's good for all seasons. It's also included, by the way, in Addendum 3 of CPD Notice 2312. So go ahead and grab that HUD language and insert it in your procurement documents and in your agreements with subrecipients, contractors, to make sure that folks are on notice that that the BAP may apply to what they're doing with you with CPF funds. So definitely encourage you to get that language in. Another question that we're seeing here, does the BAP apply to contractors and vendors or just subrecipients? And I kind of gave you some clues to that in my answer to the last question. The BAP applies to any entity who is carrying out the activity. This may include vendors, contractors, or subrecipients. The BAP requirements must be included in grant agreements, contracts, and purchase orders for the work performed or products supplied under the federal award, in this case, the CPF grants. Looking through here, a lot of applicability questions. This one is important. I think we can't make this point clear enough. Does the BAP apply to 2022 and 2023 CPF grants already obligated? So no, the BAP does not apply to those awards for CPF funds, but there's an important caveat here. If those funds are coupled with other BAP covered funds, perhaps from a different federal agency or a different funding source within HUD, and they're used in projects valued above $250,000, the BAP may apply. So keep in mind that we've provided guidance in today's webinar on CPF applicability, but there may be other considerations. Or oftentimes projects include leveraged funding, layered funding. So you'll want to look at BAP applicability through the lens of each of the funding sources that are involved in your project. Chris, are you seeing some additional questions you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, we've got a couple of waiver questions. So a question asking to provide an example of when an emergency or exigent waiver could be used. So this waiver applies when there is an urgent need by the grantee to immediately complete rehab, maintenance, alteration, construction to an infrastructure project because of a threat to life, safety, or property of residents and the community. And so imagine a CPF project that is providing operating costs and maintenance for a homeless shelter. And in the middle of the winter, the heating system in that shelter dies. The lack of heat is a threat to life and safety for those residing there. And so repairing or replacing that heating system could fall under the emergency or exigent waiver. Let's see, another waiver question. I'm really glad someone asked this. It's kind of talking through the de minimis and small grants waiver is a bit complicated. So when you're determining the de minimis of a project, you base that amount off of the federal funding for the project or for the entire project budget amount. So this is talking about the 5% for a portion of the project. So if a covered BAP material for a portion of the project comprises no more than 5% of the total cost of the covered materials used in that project not to exceed $1 million, the BAP can be waived for that portion of the project. So if you have the total cost of covered materials is $500,000, 5% of that is $25,000. That $25,000 you could cover a portion of your covered materials, and that you would not need to comply with the BAP for that portion. So let's think about it in the context of an example. The city is using CPF funds to rehab a playground. The total cost of materials used in the project is $1 million. You're able to source almost everything domestically, but you can't find a domestically produced slide that you need to fit the playground structure. You can find that slide produced internationally for $20,000. Because that's less than 5% of the total cost of materials, right, which was $1 million, the city could use the de minimis waiver to waive the BAP for that slide. All the other materials in the project still need to comply with the BAP, but for that slide, you're able to use the waiver and not comply. Clint, other questions that you have?
Yeah, so still getting some questions here on older CPF grants. So the question here is, what if we were granted in 2023, but are not submitting for reimbursement until 2024? Does this apply? And so again, under phased implementation, applicability to CPF funds is based on the obligation date, which we explained is the date Congress appropriates the funds, the final appropriation. So the BAP will not apply to FY23 CPF grants. It may apply to FY24 CPF grants because it's based on the date of the grant, not the timing of the expenditure or the reimbursement. So again, we're watching to see what Congress does. And when they reach that final appropriation. So we'll keep an eye on the FY24 awards when we're considering the phased implementation dates. Keep in mind it's based on the grant, not the timing of the expenditure reimbursement. Chris, have you seen other questions?
Yeah, so we're getting a number of questions about defining the date of congressional appropriation. So that is the actual date that the federal FY24 budget is enacted and signed into law. And Kim, I'm not sure if you have an additional point on that, but I believe that note will be made in everybody's grant award letter and grant announcement.
Yeah, let me jump in and offer that if you're trying to determine which year your grant is covered by, the year is in your grant number. Actually, you will see either a 22 or a 23 in your grant number. That's the first and easiest way to check and understand which requirements you're subject to. And when we have the FY24 grantees, they will have a 24 in their number. So, so that's the easiest way to check and confirm. And then I just want to give you a little bit of background. So we had 2 rounds of funding for CPF grantees. There are our FY22 grantees. They had an enactment for their CPF grantees December 29th, 2022. And then we had a second round of CPF funding for the FY23 grantees, and those grantees were funded on March 15th. So you don't have to be concerned, as you've heard previously, about the trigger, the application of the BAP for the FY22 and 23 grants. Unless there's a caveat and you're combining that with other federal sources of funding. And so for the grantees who are funded in 22 and 23, you should be in good shape and not be concerned here. We just want to make sure you understand the requirements going forward prospectively for FY24 grantees, or if you're in a situation where you receive funding in a subsequent round, or you're combining or using funds with other federally funded grants. And so hopefully that provides a little more clarity with regard to those enactments and who's subject and who's not.
And just to build off of Kim's point, I think there have been a couple of questions. I think there were some very early trainings for FY23 grantees where there is a consideration that the BAP may apply. It does not. If you're looking for documentation of that, you can both look at the phased implementation waiver at CPD Notice 2312, and that's also documented in the grant guide for the FY23 CPF grant. There are, I just want to pause and just acknowledge there are so many great questions about very specific case studies and kind of project examples, and kind of asking in what context would the BAP apply or not apply to different case studies or different scenarios. I just want to respond for that a little bit with a plug for a webinar that we'll be doing in late January that is completely dedicated to doing a much deeper dive into 7 or 8 different case studies that walks through both the determination process, how do you decide if a project is infrastructure or not, and kind of walk through that flow chart in a bit more detail. But then also to think about what are different ways that you can document compliance? How are you thinking about working with your subrecipients, your developers, your contractors, your vendors in documenting compliance with the Buy America preference? So I do really appreciate all those questions and do encourage all of you to join for that January webinar. And we'll highlight those dates in a minute. Clint, I think we might have time for one more question if you've got one more.
Looking through here, a lot of it, again, a number of the questions are on the phased implementation waiver date, and reiterating the information that Kim's already shared and that we've gone over.
And I did just want to say it's March 15th, 2022 was the enactment date for the 22 grants, and December 29th, 2022 for the 23 grants. I think I transposed that, so I wanted to clarify.
Thank you, Kim. We are getting a couple of questions asking for sample language that can be included in bid documents. I know, Clint, you touched on this, but it is in the notice in CPD Notice 2312, included as Addendum 3, which I think is the very last page of the notice. But that has the sample language. That will also be the language that will be included in your grant agreements, and you can copy that forward and include that in any of your agreements with subrecipients, contractors, vendors, and so on. One other question came in: if a subrecipient is hiring a contractor, does the subrecipient need to pass on the BAP requirements? The answer is yes. So no matter who is carrying out the activity, the Buy America preference requirements hold. So with that, we just have a couple minutes left. I want to highlight a couple of resources for you all. If you haven't been there already, really encourage you all to go to the BABA site on the HUD Exchange. As webinars are recorded and processed, they are posted there. There are a number of great resources that are being added every day. BABA on HUD.gov, we had a couple of really detailed questions about different waiver requirements. The waivers are posted there. There are FAQs posted there. Encourage you all to go there. We do have a number of quick guides. The BABA CPD Overview Quick Guide gives a really high-level look at the Buy America preference and the BABA Act. or CPF Quick Guide goes a bit more in depth into thinking about how does it apply to CPF programs. If you haven't, recommend that you all bookmark 2 CFR 184. Those are the Buy America preference regs. That includes things like the definition of infrastructure, definition of iron and steel, manufactured products, construction materials. Encourage you all to go there. And then we've talked about it a number of times, but do encourage you all to download a copy of CPD Notice 2312. And then if you do have questions, please submit them on the AAQ. If you've been submitting questions through the CPF pool, there's also a BABA pool that you can go into. So you just as you would with CPF, you indicate that your question is related to BABA. Please do include as much information as you can if you're an FY22 or FY23 or FY24 grantee, to help the team respond completely to your question. In terms of next steps, as I said earlier, the HUD CPD overview webinar has already been posted on the HUD Exchange. If you didn't join us last month for that, do encourage you all to go watch that. And then, as I said, in late January, January 31st, there will be a case study webinar. We will have a handful of case studies that we walk through in a bit more depth than the examples we provided today. With that, thank you all for joining. Really appreciate you all taking the time. I know everyone has so much going on. If you do have questions, please put them into the HUD Exchange. Please follow up with us. We'll try to get responses out to you as quickly as we can. Thank you and have a great afternoon.